Hey, what's up, everybody? Give it a minute. Nobody's joined yet, so script and everything. I got a script again because without a script, my ADD brain goes on so many tangents. It's impossible for anybody to follow what I'm. Like I said, I'm gonna give it a few minutes. Actually, I'm gonna refill my drink here, and I'll be right back. So hopefully, some folks will trickle in that time. Then we can get started. Give me 1 sec. Right, man. Ooh, had a good little protein. Still nothing, huh? Well, pop these up. Maybe we can share this. Who else? Who else? Who else might be up for this? All right. All right. Well, that's good, man. And stream. All right. So, man, a lot has been going on. It's been a really writing a lot. Happened. Gonna be a so. Guess let me put this up. I can kick it off because the group. I've been putting on the group on the discussion group a poll every week nowadays about what topic everybody wants to talk about. So if you want to get some input on that, or if you want to come on and talk to me live, we can have a discussion, or I can interview you about something that you know about and want to talk about, or you can interview me about something. Trolls not welcome. I don't mind a friendly disagreement, but if you know anything about the group and the project, talk about the Socratic dialogue method and the whole principle of approaching conversations as opportunities for mutual inquiry into a subject, or instead of what most people do is just these verbal wrestling matches and exchange of monologues where they get emotional and try to debate the other person, and especially on social media where it's like all a show, right? For the big others, the big unseen observers who don't probably actually give a shit. They might or might not, but usually in those kind of exchanges we're more concerned with what other people who might be watching might. It turns into more of like a political, like a rhetorical maneuvering, and not really talking about the actual topic. Trying to save yourself from looking bad and make yourself look good and make the other person look bad. You're right and they're wrong. It doesn't even matter if you are right or you're wrong, right or they're. It's all just a big show. It's a charade that fails to really look at things in an unbiased way and explore them with the spirit of curiosity, like what we ought to be doing if we really want to learn the truth about things. We have to have some level of humility, willingness to admit perhaps we're. A lot of people, they claim to do those things, myself included. We all do this very human thing to not want to look bad in front of other people, but snowballs out of control pretty quick sometimes. That's what I'm talking about when I say have somebody on. Pretty much like a typical talk radio show host when it comes to that kind of stuff. I would cut somebody off if they were going down Troll Street too fast. So that being said, yeah, let me know if you want to join the group. Let me know if you want to come on and talk. I'd love to talk to some more people instead of doing my own monologue here every night. So, whatever. Also, if you have feedback or suggestions, or you want to see something, or you want to talk about something and you don't want to come on, you don't have to. Tell me, like, hey, pull up this YouTube video, or, why don't we talk about this thing? That's all going on in the. Yeah, go for it. Join. Have a blast. Enjoy yourself. I hope to see you there, and I hope to hear feedback from you. So, welcome. The topic that everybody voted on was human consciousness and the development of human consciousness from antiquity and origins of humanity up until now. The big picture, right? So, tonight we're going to dive into that, and it's really a crazy journey. We know a lot about it now. And the cool thing about the whole process is that we're always standing on the shoulders of the game before. We get to see more than they saw before. And sometimes we forget that, especially when it comes to smart people. Past, sometimes we kind of enshrine them. Wow, they figured it all out, and we should just follow what they said. And not to diminish any of those people, pick your revolutionary figure, and they probably had a lot of insight and wisdom that they shared with us. But doing that, it actually right now, it's kind of reminds me of this this thing in the Bible. where Jesus said, so, like, they asked him where he got the authority to speak on the things that he's speaking about, what God wants and what. And he said, who gave John the Baptist the. And there's plenty of other examples, non-religious examples of it. Pretty much every great genius, every great figure in history was just some person at one point. They were doing the best they had with what they had at the time, and we, because of them, have the opportunity now. Yeah, yeah, that was that. I love that story, man. It's so good. Um, because everybody, there's another really good quote. I can pull it up here, man. I can share it in the chat. That Ken Wilber says that it's a little bit less kind of bold and abrasive and like disagreeable than what this guy said, what Jesus said, and whatever, like that, like, I am the authority, don't question me. That kind of, I think that's a misinterpretation of Ken Wilber. He basically said that he believes everybody's right about something. Everybody has some piece of the truth that put on the Twitch. Grant, I think you're on the face. I don't know if it. Anyways, he says everybody has some piece of the truth. So everybody has some wisdom, their perspective, like some that he believes needs to be recognized. Basically we look for what other people are talking about. I think the way Stephen Covey says it is seek first to understand and then to be. My face. What other people are talking about. There it is. Bam. All right. So let's jump into it, man. We're going to explore the evolution of consciousness and how it unfolded over time, particularly the rise and the eventual breakdown of what we're in now, the modernist period, the modernist worldview, which is pretty much defined by like science, this scientific worldview, and an emphasis on individualism, the importance of the individual and logic and reason and all that. And then what's happening now is like the kind of underlying philosophical assumptions of that worldview are breaking down. That's been going on for. So, at the very beginning, right? If we go back all the way, I don't know if who believes in evolution. You think of just pre-language, right? Everybody. Pre-language, pre-history. Human consciousness would be a far cry from what we experience today. So imagine living in a state of consciousness where there's no clear boundary between the rest of the world, like almost like being in a dream state where everything kind of flows together. It's difficult to make sense of anything. So before language, that's kind of how it is. If you don't have the ability to think abstractly, kind of differentiate self from other and all that, I mean, you might have some kind of primal ability to do that, but think about what Helen Keller said about it, right? Before she gained her ability to, because she was blind and deaf, so she had no real concept of that. She had no language either. So once she, through her sense of touch, like learned how to communicate, sign, and all that, it was like an explosion of her consciousness, big expansion, where she suddenly like became aware of this whole new world of ideas that she didn't have before. She even describes it in her writing, how it was like coming to life. So there's a philosopher named Gene Gebser who kind of mapped out this whole process from the what he calls the archaic structure in the very beginning. In this state, there's not much of a sense of self like what we understand. It's more of like a diffuse sense of like a dream state or spiritual, you know, more vaporous. Um, and there's a sense of primal unity with nature, sense of being in like the totality of existence and connection to all things. And some people still experience that state when they're in like a religious experience. Some people through psychedelics or near death experience or altered states of consciousness. Sometimes people have this. And I think, you can't really ask infants how it is, how they experience the world, because they can't explain it, right? They don't have language yet, but I imagine it's similar for them, right? And let's think about that for a minute. So, how does that compare to the experience of life that we have today? Like, we have all these like strict boundaries and ideas of self and other and subject object, a mind and body, all these dichotomies, dualities that we use to define the world. We don't have that. Like, how do we even function? Um, so back then, for all of humanity, that stuff didn't exist. It was like being an animal, and it's fascinating to contrast that from then how we act today. Most people don't think about it. We're born into this world, and when we learn like the way the world works and the way things are now, we kind of assume that it was always like that. People, ancestral people had the same kind of ability to see the world in the way that we see it. But when we start looking back and investigating, we see that we're skipping straight to that. But we can kind of see how it moved backwards into that, that singular point of like totality and oneness that we're talking about. So the next one that he goes to is called the magical structure, and this is like a beginning of language. So basically, our consciousness, our ability to think abstractly, to have a sense of self, and think about ideas, it evolved alongside language. In a sense, they're the same thing, because without abstract symbols, early language was like they were like pictograms, which is like a picture of like the flowing of a river would eventually become like the letter S or something, right? So before there were these abstract symbols that represented these phonetic sounds, this is like going deep into linguistics and stuff, right? I'm not a linguist, or I'm not an expert, so just a little bit about it, but um, this there's theories that like that's why music even or phonetics, certain sounds like evoke certain emotions in us because they relate to those things from way back then, like deeply ingrained in our genetic memory, that stuff. So anyways, the magical structure is moving into kind of this emergence of communication and early development of it, where there's not yet any kind of intellectual awareness or any idea of right and wrong or human rights or individuality, or more intuitive participatory engagement with the world. This is when they were doing all these rituals, and like, before the sun comes up, they would draw like a picture in the sand of, the arrow going into the deer or whatever, and then when the sun like hits it, it like makes it come true. It's like spell casting in a way. That's why they call it magical. But for these people, it wasn't like how we think of those things. It's a lot of times we look back at that and we're like, that was dumb, dude. Like, why would they think that would like have the cause and effect? Because they weren't thinking in those terms, like cause and effect. You need like logic and rationality and analytical thinking for that. So they were thinking of it more from where they came from, with the totality of things. For them, they're like mirroring they're mimicking the actual. There's not much of a difference between the picture and the ritual and the actual hunting of the animal. You know what I mean? So they're in their world, they're like making that reality come true by doing the ritual, if that makes sense. Um, because they felt this sense of interconnectedness with everything. The world is like alive and it's like an animist spirit world full of energy. So they're putting out like this ritual hunt energy, right? And symbols and myth were starting to emerge, but they were believed to like have real power, right? And it's almost like living in a world where the boundary between how we separate those things, the mental world and the physical world, that didn't exist. It's like they were blended together, right? So your thoughts, your words, your actions directly influence the physical world. So another way to think of it is like in the magical structure, there's no separation between us and the rest of the world. And it's like being in a web. You know, if you move, it like kind of shifts the whole web, right? Or being on a mattress or something. You know, it's like your movements and your actions are shifting and flowing with everything. So you can see why they look at it, and we even still use like analogies to tapestry, interwoven forces and energies. That all comes from that age of um yeah, a very cunning linguist. See, this classic joke, dude. I'm not a master debater either. So, I mean, I already kind of said it, but I mean, just think like, do you guys think that we still have elements of this kind of magical thinking in the way that we live today? Um, like symbols or how people feel connected to certain places or think places are haunted, whatever, that kind of stuff. I think it's still there, just like beneath the surface, and it's kind of what the whole point of Gene Gebser's book is. He calls it the ever present. I'll put like some references in, but he calls it the ever present origin because he says it's kind of like a pyramid. You know, the ancient archaic animal world. Right, exactly. Yeah, that is like the foundation, and then the magical consciousness is on top of that, and then the next one that we're going to talk about is on top of that, and so on, right? So he thinks it's always here with us. We think that we've gotten rid of it right now, you know, because we transcended all that. We found reason and logic and to the next level of development. Left all that stuff behind because that was all silly business. But um, he says that that's not really how it works. We're still connected deeply to all those. There's no way for us to escape from it. Anyways, so the next big turning in consciousness, the next big movement in conscious development for humanity, what he calls the mythical. So this is where people started to really develop symbolic thought and narrative, like oral storytelling tradition, those kind of things. And instead of seeing the world as interplay of spiritual forces, it's more narrative. This is where we get the big rise of gods and deities and religions and those kind of things. Myth, legend, heroes. Rituals were still there, but they were so in this era, everything kind of shifted into a kind of viewing of time and way that the world worked as like a cyclical process, you know, with the seasons or day night cycle, those kind of things. There was a lot of emphasis on these dualities, but these dualities weren't yet separated. is more like a yin yang, where it's like, now we kind of tend to elevate one of these things or make one of these things like superior. You hear people say things today like darkness is just the absence of light, or kind of frame things in a way where it's like light is good and darkness is bad. Um, whatever. Like warmth is better than cold. Those kind of things. They didn't really think of things or look at the world in that way yet at this time. More like these things were essentially they're the same thing. There is no light without dark. There is no good without evil. There is no warmth without. Um, so they're kind of in a way they're like two sides of the same coin, and they're cyclical. So the way that life and the world, everything operates is in these cycles, and a lot of the rituals that they preserved from the magical thinking era were to keep these cycles going. Especially when it came to like farming and agriculture, a development in that, where that people were more nomadic and they wanted to like appease the gods and do these like rituals to keep these cycles steady. Whenever they saw like a disruption of the cycle, they thought it was like gods were angry. They were going to kill them because nature. A lot of this is defined by like a growing desire that was already there at the origin for people to want to master and control nature, Mother Nature. But that's a whole like that's a whole archetype. That's a whole one of those things that emerged in the myth storytelling about Mother Nature being like a source of life, but also being very violent and unpredictable. You know? And that goes into like these feminine archetypes as well, about like women being um this desire to want to control that was born from keeping the floods from happening, keeping the famines from happening. People really wanted to try to like control and subjugate Mother Nature to their own will. So in some sense, like this whole process of development of human consciousness has been an exercise in that. And other things too, like we've increased our ability to cooperate and those kind of things. That's a big part of it that we see played out across the whole thing, right? So, in the mythical structure, there was a strong sense of community still, even though I think that at this point in the agrarian society, the way that we were before in tribes was like there was no difference between the tribe, the community, and the family. It was all the same thing. Like everybody was lived communally, took care of each other. They cared about each other and they helped each other and they protected each other and they looked out for each other. And I'm not saying everything was perfect. I'm not trying to idealize it and say there was no kind of like interpersonal conflicts and that kind of thing. That would be ridiculous to assume that. But I think it was less. Like imagine trying to be like a pedophile in that time. you know, how are you going to get away with that shit? Like, where are you going to hide out, or what, like, systems are you going to manipulate to be able to do that? They're just going to, like, mess you up. Like, everybody knows everything. And then moving into agrarian society, people extended their workday massively. Now they have like 10 times as much work to do. And they needed to have bigger families, more people to work on the farm. So the shift towards family away from community had already started, like in this age. And the whole like sense of community was starting to disintegrate. So even though it was a lot more community based, people had this greater sense of shared identity and collective bonds. They saw themselves as part of a larger story and like this big cosmic grand narrative process that gave their lives meaning and purpose. There was religions and the always like this call it teleology, where it's like we're getting somewhere. in all these cycles and all these processes, we're moving towards like some ultimate redemption or whatever it is. So that was always a big part of it, and that you see that played out in like even today's religion. So in that structure, there was that big sense of community and like the cyclical view of time, cycles of life, death, rebirth, living in a world where everything has its place, and you're just kind of caught up in these currents of the grand narrative. But what about that? Do you think that there's examples of that still influence us today? People still talk about, and I mean, I can think of one like right off the bat, man, is the business cycle, economics. You know, we're it's funny because like this project was to liberate us from all these cycles held down by in nature, like the day-night cycle. We have artificial lighting. We have all this shit. We can stay up all night now. We got drugs for it. We got whatever. But in doing that, like we create all these other cycles inadvertently. I think that goes to Gebser's point that like this stuff is these things are inescapable. There's like certain truths being told about reality here that are inescapable. You know, reality and our nature, nature of our consciousness. So the next big turning point is the turning into what Gebser calls the mental structure of consciousness. But that's basically what we think of as like our modern version of consciousness. Even then, there were some like subtle and pretty significant shifts too. Um, One of them he talks about in the Renaissance era. But before we skip to that, like let's talk about just the emergence of it. So the first emergence of that kind of thinking was all the way back in ancient Greece, pre-Socratics. There might have been other examples, you know, like the legalists, Confucianists in China, and in Eastern philosophy. I'm not as well educated in that, and I'm looking into that more now. I want to kind of tie all that stuff together because I feel like this is like a global phenomenon. It doesn't have to be a predominantly Western philosophy oriented thing, right? I really like the way Rick Rubin and some other people talk about it, about how like it's just kind of there. These acts of creation and bringing things into existence that people do in the world of ideas. It's kind of there, you know, in the whatever you want to call it, ether, universal consciousness, or the whatever, the world soul, or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of out there. People can pick up on it. Like it's time for this thing to happen. Start. That's why you have, you know, your you'll have an idea. Yeah, thanks. Collective consciousness. That's what Carl Jung calls it. Um, he says that artists, and specifically artists, because he's working with artists, they pick up on these vibes. They get ideas from it. It's like that's why sometimes you will hear somebody like you'll come up with an idea and then you'll hear, you know, you forgot about it, and then you know a year later or something somebody did it. And I think there's something to that. But anyways, back to where it first started, right? So the pre-Socratics, you know, it's even evident there that that shifting point, right? Because what the pre-Socratic philosophers were talking about was they were approaching things differently in a more analytical, like, how do we make sense of this? The beginnings of reason and logic. But they were saying things like the whole world's made of fire. Like the fundamental substance of everything is fire. The fundamental substance of everything is water. You know, and that with some exceptions, but like those things aren't just like I said, it's easy for us to look back and say like, man, that was dumb. that guy said everything's made of water. Like, silly. But for them, like, they're thinking of it from the age that they were in, the mythical. You know, in the mythical, those things, those symbols, like the symbol of water represents a state of deep unconsciousness itself, the deep, right? So it makes more sense when you see how those things are symbolically connected to this, that they would say that. So they were emerging from that, but the thing that distinguishes philosophy from myth is that philosophy takes analytical approach based in reason to trying to solve problems. So that was a big shift into that. So that started for a little bit there and then got destroyed, right? And it kind of, you know, didn't it was bubbling under the surface, but um, some of those kind of thinking, that kind of thinking was there, but still, like for most of the Roman period, it was dominated by. There were some people, you know, like theologians and stuff in Western philosophy that were philosophical. So there were people doing that kind of thinking, but all in all, for humanity itself, it was still kind of bubbling up under the surface, and it didn't really come for Western society, anyways, until Renaissance, Enlightenment. Because in the Renaissance, what happened was these Italians were picking up on the vibes again, and they started revolting against the Catholic Church. They saw the Catholic Church as being impersonal and taking advantage of people, exploiting them, kind of brainwashing them, using their position of power and their authority in an abusive way just for their own gain as an institution. And you know, there's a lot more to go into with that, but they advocated for a shift in religious practice towards humanity. Yeah. Separate, unconnected. Now the computer links us together. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's kind of like where we're getting to, where we want to end up in this conversation. That, like, this is the first time really in human history that everybody can kind of look out and see everybody else and see the whole world and have all this information. It's kind of wild to think. But yeah, there's definitely some issues about freedom and exploitation and mind control and all that shit. Yeah, let's get to that, man. Like, we were talking about in the Renaissance how this big shift happened to humanism. So they were basically saying like the human being should be focal point of Christianity, God, and they're talking about, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, they're talking about that it should serve the individual. So this is like a shift towards looking at the individual. Meanwhile, in Renaissance art, they're doing the same thing. This is where like the Mona Lisa and Da Vinci and all that like perspectivist art emerged from. You know, there were a lot of people before him that worked really hard on figuring out how to do that. These guys were insane, man. They were writing like books about, you know, the math that goes into it. And they really dedicated their lives to, you know, figuring out how to paint paintings. And, you know, like you learn about in school with like the vanishing point, and it's kind of like a triangle, like two triangles put together or whatever, like underneath a pyramid. But that shift, right, is a shift again towards the ego, towards the individual. In philosophy too, the big revolution happened with Rene Descartes, where like he started from this point of radical skepticism and was saying like, I can doubt pretty much everything. I can say, like, I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is true. You know, my senses can be deceived. I could just be having a dream right now. How do I know? But he said the one thing that I know for sure is that I exist. That was the I think therefore I am thing. So to most people, when you learn about that, if you learn about that in school, it makes sense. It's like, okay, okay, I see what he's thinking, and then he builds his whole philosophy from there, and you learn about it. But think about it for a second. That is a that is like a the that takes the ego self as like the starting point for reality. It all stems from I'm the most important piece in this puzzle, right? So again, you see this like big shift towards that, towards like ego individualism, which these guys didn't think it wasn't bad. They were trying to do something good, right? They were trying to say the Catholic Church is corrupt and we need to focus more on like human issues. And they had no idea what it was going to lead to this. And the Enlightenment, the Protestant Revolution, all that stuff came from that. So the Enlightenment period, well, before we skip ahead to that, like let's just say the shift towards that gave a more of a rise towards the championing of reason and logic and individual power of mental process. And humans, through that, developed the even greater ability to think in terms of concepts and categories and to dissect things and to analyze the world. And it was really like the big explosion in the dawn of rationality. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that set the stage for that, right? Like the printing press and the Catholic Church, even like promoting literacy rates and all that. Um, but really, that was the dawn of rationality, and it set the stage for the Enlightenment and the emergence of what we call the modern era, the modernist. So the Enlightenment was a period where the mental structure really came into its own as cross humanity in general. It was an era that placed reason on a pedestal above emotion and intuition and all those things that came before. And they viewed it as the highest human faculty. We want to elevate this to top tier because this is the thing that's going to save us from all of that crap that came before so it doesn't happen to us again. So the idea was that through rational thought and empirical observation that we can unlock all the secrets of the universe. And you see where this is going, right? Science and everything. And Isaac Newton. And, you know, Isaac Newton happens in this era. This big revolution in scientific thinking and scientific reductionism, scientific worldview. This was a radical departure from the previous ways of thinking and knowing things, more intuitive and participatory, narrative based, like in the mythical age. So, in even Isaac Newton, that's evident in Isaac Newton himself. He's kind of like what we were saying the pre Socratics were before, where you can see evidence of the mythical structure in them. You can also see it in Isaac Newton because he wrote more about biblical hermeneutics than he wrote about science. He was actually a member of a religious, like theological, I guess, perspective group called the Arians. That they believed that the Trinity was that promoted by the Catholic Church was mistaken, and that the Son was actually subservient to the Father. The Catholic Christian doctrine has them all as equal. He said that that was wrong, and he wrote a lot about that, among other things. But he wrote a lot about religion and spirituality, even more than he did science. And in his spare time when he wasn't inventing calculus with Leibniz, he was writing about that stuff. Both of those guys were very into religion. But all anybody really seems to remember him for nowadays is the science, because they want to get rid of all that stuff because it's not scientific, and the only science is the only way, reason is the only way. So think about the impact of that big shift. Suddenly, the individual is the center. Philosophers like John Locke, Immanuel Kant argue that people are these autonomous agents, like they're these little particles or these little gears in the machine come together. They form these bigger structures. They're the most important parts. They're the ones that makes it all run. And the modernist worldview championed individuality over the collective. Celebrated the power of human reason to, like, as the major engine in shaping history, destiny. So that also broke humanity out of this focus on cyclicity and cycles and shifted everybody's perspective towards growth and progress. And you can also see where this is leading into like capitalism. So even though it gave us like incredible advancement, all of technology comes from that. We developed a scientific method that gave us so much insight into the way the world works. We gained deeper understanding of nature, matter, how the brain works, how the mind works, um, all kinds of things. Transportation, what you were saying, Grant, like the internet and communication and all that. But it also came with a big price. You know, process of differentiating ourselves from the world, we started to see nature more as something that we dominate, control, and didn't really need it anymore. Oh, we're better than that now. We figured it out. Fun. And it's also kind of the enshrinement of this subject verb object relationship in language, where it's like we are always the subject, individual, and everything else is the object, you know, including other people sometimes, objectifying people and whatever. We objectify everything. And it's because of this, like this new way of thinking led into that. And I'm not saying that like things weren't bad before and that violence wasn't a people didn't treat each other like shit. Like they definitely, um, in some ways, much worse ways. You know? Like violence was just kind of like a active part of these cycles. But what I'm talking about isn't that. I'm not saying that the reason we have violence and the reason we have problems is because people are now objectifying. I'm saying that before that, people didn't have the ability to look at things, well, than the other thing, other people as subject, verb, object. You know, I mean, maybe they did to some extent, but not like this. You know, not like I'm the creator of my own destiny. Everybody else is like a side character in my story where I'm the main. That wasn't a thing. Um, so um, it turned the world into an object. And it turned everything into this collection of resources to be studied and categorized and analyzed and exploited and used for whatever purposes we wanted. It turned into this worldview of seeing everything as this like dead space, you know? Yeah. Yeah, exactly, man. Yeah, I mean, for sure. Back in the older days, it was like super violent. One of the things I find really interesting about it, though, too, is that in the small tribes, right? Back in when we were talking about how it was animal consciousness, you know, even you can see this kind of behavior in like dog packs and other social animal groups where they're very wary of people who aren't members of their group. Humans were more like that for sure than they are today. But the thing is, you know, when humans and Neanderthals coexisted, for instance, the thing that one of the things that human tribes showed was the ability to trade between each other. You know, they found like seashells in the archaeology of tribes that were up in the mountains. They found like knives and stone tools that had come from like hundreds of miles away that that tribe had no access to. It was like evidence of trade. And the Neanderthals had none of that. Like if you weren't part of the group, you weren't welcome. You know, you weren't trustworthy enough to communicate with. They only fought with each other. Humans did a lot too, more than they do now. But there's a theory that that was the big deciding factor between, like, other things they talk about, like Neanderthals had no throwing weapon, for instance, and Neanderthals' bone structures was different, whatever. But, like everything, there's a lot of factors, but you could imagine how Homo sapiens' ability to cooperate more than other similar species would have given them a big advantage. And in a way, I see this process also being a process of expanding that ability. You know, now we've created all these systems. Like, you know, I'm always criticizing capitalism, but for what it's worth, it did create a system that allowed humans to cooperate on a larger scale than they were before. So I think this whole story is kind of a process of that too, expanding that capacity to cooperate and help each other. You know, might not be in perfect ways, but better and better ways all the time. Very slow moving, but there's kind of, it's moved slow usually, and then it's punctuated by these like rapid bursts of change, like in the Enlightenment, huge burst of change in Western civilization. So, and I think we're coming up on another one very soon. It's kind of what we're building toward. So, you know, the scientific method, scientific mind allowed us to explore everything. Got better and better at certain things, but we also paid this big price for it. It's like increased othering, objectification of the world, you know, like deadening of the world. It's like where we started as what you were saying, Grant, animacy, where it's like the world is alive and it's spiritual. It's like everything's connected and everything's like amazing. Now everything's dead. It's like cold, dead matter just out there floating in space, like abandoned, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be used and exploited by. It's like very depressing, you know. And I mean, in a lot of ways, like the things that science reveals about the universe and the astronomy and all that is like mind blowing and awe inspiring. But the general worldview of objectification of all things kind of leaves everybody feeling like very isolated, you know, and alone. Because we're othering everything all the time, us and then everything else, right? And that's a lonely place to be. And I don't think these philosophers and these painters and these religious leaders were intending for that to happen. I just don't think that they saw that as a consequence. So even though we saw ourselves like as to becoming masters over nature, it really started to, like, I mean, look at all the things like the cycles that we've broken free, saying the day night cycle, and like fucking up our sleep cycles. Maybe separating ourselves from nature so much wasn't right move. You know, you know, maybe we made some like fundamentally bad assumptions about the way the world works and the way like reason and logic have their place. Um, so I don't know. What do you think? How's it affected our relationship with the world and each other and the environment? What's the cost to the planet environment, our mental health, like the mindset that enabled us to make all this progress also created a sense of profound disconnection and alienation from nature, from the world. I think now we're kind of starting towards a path of resolving that. Because, well, I guess let's take a closer look at what the modern era brought, how all this stuff has worked, like even more recently. In the last, I want to say, like the last 80 years or so. After the Industrial Revolution and or the digital age, but like around the 50s, 60s, like the post-war era. I know we're skipping over a lot of stuff, but all that stuff was really like the rise and the flourishing of modernism, like modernist architecture, Art Deco, and Roaring Twenties, and all that shit. So we moved away from monarchies into democracies, which makes sense. The focus on individualism. I mean, not true democracies, but wannabe democracies at least. More towards, more away from like dictatorial empire building and more towards this ideal of individual autonomy and giving people like participatory ability and things. um yeah, for sure. Yeah, they were doing that. They were developing all those ideas. I mean, it all ties into that same shit, right? It all ties into that. Yeah. No, I think it's yeah, like we had all the rise of all that stuff, like the systems thinking and all that started developing. And it's even more complex now. Like I think it goes through these periods of like deconstruction and reconstruction. It's really kind of like what a lot of the postmodernists have been talking about since the 60s. French dudes talking about how all this shit is bullshit, all the modernist assumptions. Um, but yeah, like pretty much all the like the whole German phenomenology and the Descartes, the Kant, the like Nietzsche. I see that a lot in him. He's a obviously the dude's like fully embracing egoism, talking about like how everybody needs to just do what they want to do, basically. Kant? I don't know who that is. But yeah, for sure, they did a lot of deconstruction, like Deleuze, Co, all those guys. But like, look, yeah, so I'm just skip ahead to that part, man. I wrote a little bit about that, like disintegration. Oh, Lacan. Yeah, yeah. Um, so like you were saying, man, the postmodernist stuff, they started to see cracks in the worldview. It was like this hilarious moment. There was this guy, Francis, his name, Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama. Basically, after the United States like had beaten the USSR and the Berlin Wall came down, he wrote and he proclaimed that we had reached the end of history. This is the pinnacle of liberal democracy, is the end all be all, and this is like the best. It doesn't get any better than this, basically. And of course, he's been like ridiculed and laughed at forever. So. But this is kind of what these postmodern, even in the early stages of that, kind of what you're talking about, that era, like with Karl Marx, reacting to the Industrial Revolution, and the early sociologists like Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, talking about, like Max Weber especially, already deconstructing and criticizing the modernist worldview back then, the whole iron cage thing. And he basically observed that this shift into individualist liberalist thinking, which liberalism, a lot of people, they get that fucked up in the US. They think liberal means like Democrat, which it's not. Like a liberal, all Republicans are liberals also, in like the academic sense, anyways, because uh, liberal in philosophy just means that you believe that the individual and individual freedom is like the most important thing. The individual is like the building block of society. Individuals, you know, compromising with each other to create cultural, social norms, and rules, and all that stuff. That's how you build a society. And yeah, liberty, liberal, liberty, libertarian. It's all the same shit. So, but Max Weber was saying that this that view of things, the social construct, whatever, creates increasing levels of bureaucracy, like which is what the Romans had too. You know, they had this huge system of bureaucracy and rules to like manage this huge empire, and he saw that people were basically recreating that under the guise of like their freedom, right? But this bureaucracy that they were creating was like building a cage around them that was like shrinking. You know, they were like putting themselves in this smaller and smaller box all the time with all these rules and like layers of bureaucracy. And they're basically like, we're turning ourselves into robots, like the making sure that we conform to all these rules and shit that we're creating. And I think what the postmodernists did was they just kind of tried to blow all that shit up. And I really like the metaphor that Deleuze, Guattari use. They call it deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So they're taking ideas like, you know, whatever. It could be, it doesn't even have to be what they were talking about. You could take any idea, like masculinity or freedom, and just look at what do we think that that is. And we basically, we've created through our abstraction and our language, we've created these like mental maps of what we say those ideas are, these territories. But what they were saying is that the territory isn't, the map isn't the land. You know, the land has no boundaries, right? You drew those. They're pretty much arbitrary to some extent. I mean, they're formed through, you know, whatever. They're not completely arbitrary. You know, they're not real in the like physical sense. So what they talked about doing was deterritorializing these ideas and exploring them and reterritorializing them to see like maybe there's more to it. Maybe we can think of it differently. And I think that pretty well captures like the whole spirit of the postmodernist project. But I think what ended up happening in effect was that the postmodernists, they pretty much just deterritorialized everything and didn't and nothing's really reterritorialized yet, you know. Um, it's just created this like chaos space where all like values are relative and people are just kind of just making whatever shit up they want. Like, that's why people make fun of that stuff. Like I identify as a turkey in my past life. And not that I'm like making fun of people who are like exploring these things, or but what I'm saying is that like there you can't just make up whatever shit you want about what reality is. Like there's still like a world beyond but I think the good thing about it is that it's created this possibility space for us to now explore those things and move forward into something different. And that will play like this pivotal role in shifting all of the fucking bullshit that we're doing that's based on the modernist worldview, destroying the world and being, like Weber was saying, trapped in this cage, this box of seeking infinite growth and just like destroying the whole world and ourselves. And that's where we come back to what Gene Gebser was talking about, and a few other people. Like I think a lot of people anticipated this whole emergence of a new structure of consciousness or a new worldview that's emerging now. And Gebser was saying it was even like early signs of it emerging back in the 40s. And I think he's right because there were people back when Albert Einstein did this, the theory of relativity and all that. There were immediately philosophers who were saying like, wait, let's think about the implications of this, what you're saying, and like this scientific worldview and scientific reductionism and all that. Like Alfred North Whitehead, for instance, big one. Um, and I think his process philosophy pretty well captures this whole idea of what Gene Gebser's talking about. This because it's very based on obviously process and like more systems thinking, more like of a holistic view, and kind of re-embracing some of those older views of, like we were saying, the magical consciousness structure where people kind of saw themselves like in this web. It's like how language works. Think about it. Like no word has a real meaning without other words. You know what I mean? Like they it they depend on each other. And that's kind of what they're doing with that's kind of what these like more holistic thinkers, integral thinkers are talking about, like the way that not just our mapping of reality works, but like reality itself. I mean, yeah, that's true. I think they have created like, when we talk about like the postmodernist view in like social groups and um, politics, I think it's easiest to point at really where I think it blew up and took off was the counterculture movement of the 60s, right? And the free love, like hippies, like rethinking of those kind of value systems, counter to traditional modernist value systems. And that was at the same time as these French guys were like putting forth their postmodernist theories. And I think that we can look at some of the things that happened there, like with what we were talking about earlier, values that people are kind of in this chaos space where they just are making up with their own shit, right? But wait, what do you mean? Communist Manifesto. He talks about shared values. Yeah, yeah. Or so are you saying that he was saying like we need to destroy shared values to implement communism, or oh yeah, yeah. I know what you're saying. Yeah, something I find really interesting about Karl Marx is how much of his ideas he just lifted directly from Hegel. Because that's something that Hegel talks about a lot. Yeah, I don't know about remember that from like what Marx was saying, but I know from what Hegel was talking about, the inversion of values and stuff was that this is just like a natural process that happens. It's not like people do it on purpose for like political strategic reasons or something. But I know for sure that the idea that Karl Marx was talking about in the Communist Manifesto was not like what a lot of people think it is. You know, like the heavily propagandized, like, oh, the government should control everything. Like, you read this Communist Manifesto is small. It's like a tiny little pamphlet. It was made to be like a propaganda polemic, you know, to like basically get working people, mobilized against, you know, these like oppressive forces that were controlling all of these industries, it's like industry barons and because the industrial revolution was fucking terrible, dude. But yeah, the kind of end state of it that they envisioned was like the workers rising up in this rebellion and then seizing control of the government themselves, and eventually it leading into like an anarchy state where they didn't even need a government. So it was really like an anarchist theory to begin, which a lot of like what he talks about, I think, in some of the other stuff, the Das Kapital and everything, doesn't so much agree with that. But yeah, I feel like Alex Jones and a lot of these like communists, Red Scare people, they really kind of talk about Karl Marx in a way masterminding all this psychology, like subversion tactics to enslave everybody, something or what. I really think he he was doing the opposite. He was kind of saying that like that's actually what capitalism is doing to everybody. And what I'm saying is that I see what he was saying. Like he's reacting to kind of the same thing Max Weber was saying about modernism. Like this is gonna screw everybody. We need to do something about it. So he was like a direct opposition and reaction to capitalism, the rise of capitalism. And it's funny though because he was still very modernist in his views. Like everybody at the time was trying to prove that they were scientific, and their worldview was very physical based and science based. So, like I was saying, um, Hegel has something called the Lord and Bondsman dichotomy, where he talks about Nietzsche kind of stole it to master slave dialect, similar, where he says like, you know, there's one dominator and one like subject, and the subject like creates all the value and does all the good. They're everything that the master wants to be, what they want to see themselves at. So they need each other basically. Like the master needs the bondsman to, see themselves, vice versa, because the bondsman wants to be free and wants to be a master of themselves. So like it's this cyclical relationship, and then talks about all that other stuff, like how this works with the dialectic process and the inversion of values and all that. And Marx pretty much took all that shit because Hegel was an idealist. He didn't see the world as like consisting mainly of physical shit. It was just like mental. It's a world of ideas, and this whole process happened in like this idea space. Well, Marx took that and he just applied it to physical work. Said it was all class struggle, and so Hegel calls that process the dialectic process, which is like a nod to Socrates' dialectic form of conversation. But Marx took that process and he didn't even change it. He just called it dialectical materialism. Right? So it's like he he made it a modernist. He made it like a modernist version, you know, um, a materialist version. So there, I think both of these ideas are still based in modernism, and that's the problem. They're confined by the limits of that, right? So what I'm saying is that like I think both of them have their points. I really agree with a lot of what he criticized about capitalism, as well as like Max Weber and some of these other critics of this whole process, how it works, and how it's really just like an extension of feudalism and like empire building and all that. It's kind of smuggled all that stuff. We're still doing the same thing. We're still like having a bunch of people controlled by a few people. You know what I mean? And I think these are the problems all these guys are trying to overcome. Like the both the neoliberal economists like Hayek and all them, and you know, these guys who were saying like free market is the only way to set people free, and they were criticizing communism for, you know, leading into authoritarianism and whatever. You know, communist socialist theorists were doing the same thing to capitalism. But I think I feel more sympathetic personally to the criticisms of capitalism because that's the conditions we're living in. You know, like we're seeing that in action with us here. And whatever, I know a lot of people like they have different ideas about it, and they are like, no, it's because of communism, and it's because of leftists, and it's because of socialism, whatever. But what I'm thinking, questioning, is maybe it has more to do with the underlying modernist worldview. Because really, like basically what Max Weber was saying, this focus on individualism and liberalism, political liberalism, necessarily leads to that. You know, once we put these things in motion in big enough groups of people, it leads to that. It's another thing people say about these systems all the time. They say, like, oh, well, it works in a small group of people. Once you get like too big, it does like it starts to have problems. But I mean, I feel like that's pretty much true of any of like any, you know, like the people living in tribes, they didn't need a fucking political theory to manage them. You know what I mean? This is all about like um because we have to, right? And I think there's maybe some value in looking at like how do we capture the efficiency and the dynamic of the little group, especially like with what we know about human psychology and all that shit. Because something I like to talk about a lot is the Dunbar's number and like our mental capacity to have emotional connections with so many people. You know, like I think a good way to really visualize it and connect with it for pretty much anybody who drives a car is like the road rage mentality shit. You know, like some fucking asshole cuts you off in traffic, and you like, I don't know, depending on what kind of driver you are, but maybe you like end up driving next to the person. For sure, you like look over and you, this motherfucker. I got to see this person's face who did this to me, man, so they know how mad I am. but but then you look over, and if it's like your grandmother or something, how are you gonna feel? You know, that probably all of that shit goes away immediately. I mean, if it's just some random person, you're like, screw you. That's what we were talking about, like with the othering stuff and everything. But why is it like that? You know? And yeah, there's people that are like varying levels of emotional closeness and levels of trust with us and everything. But what the Dunbar number idea is that he was saying, this guy's a psychologist, but he was like, you know, cross pollinating with neurology and to do this theory of well, what he ended up saying was that your most people's brains, average human, can only handle about 150 close emotional connections with other people. They just can't keep up with more. So at that point, it starts to get overwhelming, and you treat them as like less than family, basically, or less than a friend. And then like that causes problems. That causes these kind of problems because they're naturally like not part of your group. It's like we're hardwired in a way for tribalism. So how do you arrange, like, given that, if that's a fact, right, if we accept that, how do you arrange society around that? Because this is not something that the founding fathers were thinking about. This is not something that these people in the Enlightenment that came up with the ideas of liberal democracy and all that shit were thinking about, right? They didn't foresee the problems that we're having. So that's what I'm saying, is that now we're at a point where we know so much more that, yeah, there were these like great thinkers and like geniuses and great leaders and shit back then, but they gave us this opportunity to do something better now. You know what I mean? Like, we shouldn't be arguing over what Karl Marx and Friedrich Hayek said, Milton Friedman, or like, it's great to read those guys and see what happened and get like a more context for what's happening now. But when people read those things and this is the thing, dude, this is it, this guy figured it out, like, that is just, you're like killing everything, any possibility of anything, just like what Fukuyama was saying. Fukuyama, like, this is the end of history, we can't do anything better now. Like, people still say that shit. People still believe that, like, America's got it, like, this is it, dude. But it's funny to me because what we're talking about, this emergence of the integral consciousness structure in this new way, like, one of the fundamental principles of it is that we have to realize that even with what we know right now, we won't be able to create something perfect. It's going to have problems. There's going to be things that we don't know about yet, that we haven't figured out yet, that come up later. So it needs to leave room to evolve. And I do think some people, like in the founding fathers, so they tried to do that, of the United States, tried to do that to some extent. But, it's a process, and it needs to keep going, and it needs to evolve past these fundamental assumptions that we've made about the way the world works and what's going on in the world. Because with a lot of the stuff in the Enlightenment, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, with the whole, like, getting rid of animism and getting rid of emotion and intuition. One of my favorite philosophers back then is David Hume. Even though, like, he's generally seen as like the father of empiricism, and like that leads kind of directly into scientific theory and method and everything. And it's very like physical world based. But I don't know. I think unless you really read him and get where he's coming from and try to, I don't know. I always try to put myself in people's shoes and like imagine I'm them, and I feel like I do a decent job. Philosophers and stuff. But I feel like he's everybody really gets oversimplified and put in their little boxes, and like, this is who they are and what they were and what they said, and this is all you need to know. And this is oversimplification shit. But anyways, what I'm getting at is that he had some really interesting views on causality itself, which he basically said there's no way to know if this whole thing we're basing all this shit on actually exists. It's just an assumption. To go down. Basically, there's no way to prove it. There's no way to. I guess we can hit like a brief, because like an analogy for it is something that they call the black swan, and it's not the black swan that remember that Malcolm Gladwell, or I don't remember that book right now, but these black swan events that changed the world or whatever. It's based kind of on that. But because the whole black swan thing is about something they call the problem of induction, where it's like you can look at things in the world and you can say that swan's white, that swan's white, that swan's white, thousands of years, and never see a black swan. You're telling everybody the whole time all swans are white, all white. Then one day there's a black swan, just like destroys that. Oh shit. All right, there's white and black swans now, and he was kind of saying that that same problem applies to all of science and to the idea of causality and cause and effect principle. The idea that one thing causes another thing is like that. Because the only reason they think that is because we've seen the same thing happen a bunch of times over and over and over. And there's nothing like written anywhere or talk to God and he told us that that's the way it's always going to be. He says, like, for all you know, it could just be different tomorrow. And I think that's really interesting in how it ties into the stuff with Alfred North Whitehead and like their ideas about the way the world works. Because science, the mainstream view in science today says that there's these laws of the universe. That's just the way it is, and that's the way it's always been, and it always will be. And that was like programmed into the simulation or whatever. Like at the beginning of the universe, that's the way it was, and it's been that way. And there's no real explanation that they give to why. It's just like we're discovering these things by doing all this research. But what process philosophy and Whitehead are proposing is something way more nuanced and different. And they're kind of saying that these forces that everything is built upon, that are being more and more revealed in quantum physics, because Whitehead was like writing at the time of the very onset of quantum physics. And he was looking at the implications. So what he was saying was that the way that matter works, the way that the world works, is more of a process of habituation, where it's like and I think this is a pattern that gets repeated through so many levels of things, like your brain. Read a book called The Brain That Changes Itself a while back, and he made an analogy to the way your neural pathways form when you're a child. He related it to walking through the snow, like fresh fallen snow, and there's different footprints going everywhere. But the minute somebody follows the same set of footprints, somebody else follows and somebody else follows, it carves out a path. And the more people that go on that path, the harder it becomes to change the path. So that's the way those things form over time. He's like, you can still change them. It just takes more deliberate effort and whatever. But what Whitehead was saying was that this is basically the way the formation of matter works in the first place. These things aren't necessarily like preset laws. They evolved this way, and they've become so habituated that they've almost like concretized themselves. And it's the same thing too with what we were talking about with the process of like the unfolding of human consciousness, where these like archetypes and these ideas that are in storytelling and myth, and like the Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey is a part of that. What's up, Lou? Oh, thanks for coming, bro. So the hero's journey is like, this is a story that's repeated throughout every culture in humanity. These archetypes of that are captured in astrology, like the Martian archetype of like the warlord, or the trickster archetype of like Loki, the god Loki, those kind of things. Like those all exist in every culture because they're basic, like fundamental human experiences. And this is kind of what he's saying, is that like this whole process of the unfolding of the world and the growth and like accretion of things, this buildup of things, is are structures like that, where it's like we have a foundational, and we're building upon that, and then we're building upon that, building upon that. And that's where we're at now, is that we built the modern era from the mental structure. And now postmodernism has dissolved a lot of those assumptions and allowed for this next integral consciousness where it's more based on systems thinking, incorporating the value pluralism of postmodernism, but in a way that makes sense, where it's not just like make up whatever you want. It's still grounded in reality, but maybe there was more to it than we thought before, like Deleuze and Guattari were saying. Maybe like the best way to maybe what society is different than just individual actors acting rationally in their own self-interest. Or like the way the market works best, the way economics should be arranged is around that idea, because that idea was wrong. You know, I bring up that book a lot too, the Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he was saying that the way that people's brains take shortcuts and the way that we think and act, it undermines that idea that we act in our own self-interest, and the idea that we act rationally. We don't act rationally all the time. We don't act in our own self-interest. And that dude won a Nobel Prize for that. There's lots of good examples he gives in there, but if that idea wasn't correct, and there's more to this, like the Dunbar's number thing and the hardwired for tribalism thing. How do we incorporate that into a new paradigm? That's really what a lot of these integral thinkers and holistic understanding of reality folks are talking about. So it involves a return to a sense of presence and wholeness. And it, to me, like it reflects a lot of the stuff that Eastern philosophy is saying forever, which is funny. It's like being present and aware of what's happening at the moment. It's like coming full circle almost. And I guess that's another process that repeats all the time. But, if you're born with this like vital presence of what's happening like an animal, right? But without the higher consciousness, like now it's like coming back full circle to that vital presence again, but with that higher awareness. You know what I mean? Which is I find it pretty crazy. But I think that's what's happening right now. It's like a recognition of the intrinsic value of not just all people, but of all reality. You know what I mean? Like back to kind of re-embracing a lot of those things that we lost in the animism and the myth, the age of myth, and like the magical thinking era and all that. We just kind of, through this like elevation of reason and logic and scientific worldview, we've kind of dismissed all that stuff. Emotions are bullshit. Spirituality's bullshit. Science and logic are the king of everything, and everything else is just all crap. Like that, I think, not just like emotionally and spiritually destroyed us, but it's leading to the destruction of the world and society and humanity. So it's like, it's obvious that we have to adapt and evolve or die, or become maybe, I think like really if you follow that process to the end point of kind of what Max Weber was saying, how this like bureaucratization of everything, all these layers of management and shit create this cage that constricts us down into this more like process based, very robotic way of behaving, that I think literally like we become robots, dude. Like nobody wants nobody wants that. I mean, maybe Elon Musk wants that, or he wants us to become robots so he can control all of us. I don't know. It's either, I guess it's either we become robots for the tech overlords or we liberate ourselves. I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see what we're doing. But I'm on the side of the liberation, dude. I think we're really kind of at this pivotal moment, though. The evolution of consciousness and society, and called to move beyond the limitations of modernism and embrace a worldview that's more integral, holistic, satisfying for all of us. And it's not just like a thing that's happening in philosophy, academia, or intellectual people. Like, I see this happening. Go on the internet. I see kids like being more interested in esoteric spirituality, Carl Jung's psychology, all that shit. I think it's good. It's good that it's a sign of that. You know, that this isn't, it's not only just understanding the world differently or taking a bigger picture view, actually seeking out ways to live different. Like Elon Musk, like the king of Mars, go to Mars and he could show you the way. I don't know, dude. I think one of the things that's interesting about like people always say Donald Trump's trying to be a dictator. Um, but it's funny that if we had a dictator, they could destroy all that shit. You know what I mean? Like maybe not in the best way. Like maybe it would suck for a while, but if we had a king or a dictator, like I'm just spitballing shit, dude. I'm not saying this is what we should do. But if we had like an autocrat or a despot or an absolute ruler, um they could dismantle all that shit, you know? Yeah, it could happen, I guess. Like one of my favorite stories, dude, of leadership shit in history is this guy in Roman era, like early Roman, the Republic before the Empire. His name, like when it was still, when it wasn't like an emperor ruling, it was still like a public. There was a guy named Cincinnatus. They had a like a slave revolt or something. I think it was twice actually. I don't know what the second time was. One of them was for sure a slave uprising, which whatever. Forget about that. But they had this crisis, right? The Republic had this crisis and they didn't know how to solve it. But they knew that Cincinnatus would be able to handle it. But he was retired. He was off living on his farm, like minding his own business and wanting to just like live a simple life. So they came to him and they asked him, like, hey, can you fix this problem? Like, we'll give you absolute power over the whole everything. Like, you got full control. And he was like, all right. And he went in and he did it. Yeah, he did it. And then he was like, all right, I'm going back to the farm, man. You guys got it. And he gave it back to him, dude. He gave the control of the republic back to the senators. And I'm pretty sure he did that twice actually. But it's funny because the reason that we even have term limits in the United States is because George Washington was inspired by that guy, and after he did his 2 terms, he was like, "No more, dude. I'm done." And for a long time, I'm not sure what the year was, but that wasn't even a law. It was just a tradition. It was like an honorary tradition for presidents to step down after their second term. They had to. And also the city of Cincinnati is named after that. There was a secret society named the Order of Cincinnatus that thought that guy was some kind of fucking historical leadership badass, like a role model for leaders, and they founded the city of Cincinnati. So yeah, I think that's a pretty cool story. And like, if you had leaders like that, maybe. But it's just it's so tough, man, because people are so corruptible, bro. Like the was that Abraham Lincoln quote where he says like, if you really want to test somebody's character, give them power. I think that's true. And sometimes it's not even intentional. It's just like people don't know how they're gonna react in those situations, and their own personal like psychology and whatever demons they're fighting and shit. How that's gonna come out when they're in those situations. But yeah, I don't think it's impossible. I just think yeah, that's like the fast way. What I really see and like what even some of the founding fathers talk about this shit, like James Madison. It's probably my. I mean, I don't think any of them were like the end all be all of fucking political ideas, but Thomas Jefferson definitely like knew some bad shit was going to happen if we let the banks and the corporations take over. He was right about that. But James Madison, he's probably my second favorite of them. Um, he talked a lot about transparency in the government and education being crucial for good democracy because the people who are voting have to be well educated and they have to know what's going on in the government. Can't keep a bunch of secrets from them. Expect them to make right decisions. I think we're way beyond that point where it's like it doesn't even fucking matter now. Like we're not in charge of shit and our shit. But I think these guys have some good points, and what I see, if we want that, if we really want freedom, right? We really want freedom for ourselves. We have to stop wanting to give up our freedom to leaders who promise us safety and security. Let's put them in because we don't need that unless it's like maybe an emergency thing, like what Cincinnatus and they gave him Palpatine powers, and luckily he didn't go full Palpatine. But I think it always runs that risk that they're gonna go fucking Emperor Palpatine mode on you, dude. Uh, the people who are running shit right now they have definitely done that. The like whatever 3,000 people or whatever it is that are running the fucking world right now. We're like pawns in their game. They don't give a shit about if they ever die or get fucking disease. They're having their fucking pissing contests with each other, and that's more important. More important than anything, dude. It's more important than the environment. More important than the future of humanity. Gonna end up turning everything into Mad Max plus the Matrix. I mean, maybe if we had the right king for a day, but I don't see how you could get that person in charge of shit. You know what I mean? Because they got so many levels, so many layers of insulation, um, protecting protecting that. Like people think Trump is going to do that stuff, but I feel like that really betrays a like lack of understanding of his psychology, you know, and also his like history. Like I wrote something. That's what I said. I feel like the idea that Trump somehow has some kind of benevolent savior agenda is very optimistic and maybe doesn't take into account his past and social group and his general psychology. The guy is a he's kind of an egomaniac. Right? That's how he acts. It's like pretty obvious to see what's important to him. And it would be cool if the QAnon people what they were saying. It'd be cool if he did that and like drained the swamp and all that, but you know, all of the QAnon people got duped by the Republicans. The Republicans co-opted the QAnon movement the same way the Democrats co-opt every grassroots left wing. And they funnel it into the machine, the swamp or whatever you want to call it. Like they kept getting tricked into thinking that their conspiracy theory was coming true in spite of actual evidence. But Trump and his strategist, mostly Steve Bannon, with the help of the GOP, were able to co-opt the QAnon movement and all of the alt-right internet culture, the Proud Boys, the nationalism shit, the red pill people, the same way the Democrats do with the leftist shit. They use it to funnel everybody into voting for Democrats or Republicans. Well, Republicans in this case, which is owned by the corporations, which is part of the fucking machine. There's no, like, I don't know why people think Trump would want to fuck that up, because he's benefiting greatly from it. You know, the Republicans are fundamentally the same as the Democrats. They serve the same masters, want to assimilate everything into the Borg, and even if somebody was like wanted to do the king for 16 days and like take down the swamp, they're gonna, I mean, how are they gonna get elected in the first place? Like, they disrupt everything. Like, any kind of leftist anti-government movement gets immediately disrupted. They send people in, bro. They fucking send people in to incite violence. Like, they send paid, like, the police. Like, I've I know about this shit. They send plants in. It's like covert ops shit to try to pretend like they're part of them and like get people pissed and get them to like break windows and like do shit that they can get arrested for, so that they can fuck them up, and then the news can say like, "Oh, look at these fucking assholes," And they're masters at that, dude. Like, anything that people do to try to rise up, they infiltrate it and squash it. They put you on a fucking FBI watch list, and they start fucking with you and trying to scare you. Like, they do it to journalists all the time. Richard Medhurst is one of the journalists I follow a lot, and he talks a lot about the Israel-Palestine stuff. He's a Syrian British journalist, British citizen from Syria. I don't know. I think he's born in whatever. It doesn't fucking matter. He got arrested at Heathrow Airport not that long. It was like a shakedown. I mean, when he got out of jail, he was talking about it. They didn't have anything, like, they had no reason to fucking arrest him. He didn't do anything. Tried to accuse him of a bunch of shit, but they had to let him go after they held him like 3 or 4 days or something. And they were trying to accuse him of like terrorism. And when they let him go, he was talking about like he thinks the only reason that they were doing that to him is because he's like speaking out against it and getting some kind of traction. That's what I was telling you, Lou, like the other day, that as long as nobody takes you seriously, dude, they're not gonna fuck with you. But if you start getting people to pay attention and becoming a problem for them, like, of course they're gonna do something. And get the environmental. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh no, I don't know what you're talking about. I thought for a second I thought you were talking about Greta, but yeah, that's a crazy story. You should tell us more about that. I don't know if people on Facebook can see it. I'll share what you said. Um, yeah, that's crazy. No, I was saying I thought you were talking about Greta, because Greta has recently been talking about how capitalism is like the driving engine behind all of the environmental destruction and all that shit, and she's speaking out about it, and the media hasn't been covering any of that shit. Just pretty much disappeared, which is odd but not surprising. Oh, nice, dude. I'm looking at some of that stuff you sent, Grant. Counterculture of the 60s in the United States and alternative consciousness. Post-war American politics. What is this from, though? What is this? What's up on? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, bro. Can't have that. I thought you were gonna send the Communist Manifesto thing. But yeah, dude, these motherfuckers were like the FBI was doing heavy fucking infiltration and research and like, publishing memos and documents on what was going on in the hippie culture and the civil rights movement and all that stuff. Like so that they could fucking dismantle it. Thoreau, Freud and Jung, dude. Yeah, they're like saying all of this shit is fucked. Eastern philosophy. Can't have people learning about that, man. It's from the devil. Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you guys sharing everything that you had to share, man. I really kind of just wanted to wrap up like with this. I know we went way over time. Glad like everybody still watching, sharing, and giving their opinions on stuff. But to bring it back to the whole idea that we were talking about in the first place, the unfolding of consciousness and the evolution of human consciousness, is like I guess basically to re-sum up the whole idea, especially for people who showed up. The idea we were talking about that consciousness started out as almost like animal consciousness and our ability to like form these mental maps of things, navigate the world of ideas, it directly evolved with our ability to speak, to write, to form language, like our levels of abstraction in language. You know, whereas early language was like pictograms and it eventually evolved in like the idea space and abstraction levels kept taking this like meta perspective. It's like step back and look, and step back again and look, and that's a process that's been repeating over and over. This is just another iteration of it. So looking at modernism and the big shift that happened there, because when you're inside of something, inside, it's hard to like see what it is. Like imagine what it looks like. So where we've gotten to now through modernism and then postmodernism kind of breaking down some of those barriers and letting us look at the big picture, we see that we're kind of at this like turning point, this possibility space for something new to emerge in public consciousness, which has been like in some people's consciousness since around the 40s, maybe. Especially after some of the implications with quantum physics, and maybe even before that. I was saying like I feel like Max Weber, in particular, kind of anticipated a lot of this stuff that happened in postmodernism in the 60s. But the work of postmodernism has mostly been attacking modernism and breaking down the barriers and the assumptions of modernism, and has left us in this like chaotic possibility space for this integral consciousness to take root and start growing in the public collective consciousness, um, and move beyond the limitations that Max Weber was talking about with that modernist worldview. Embrace a more holistic way of thinking, a more like integrated web way of thinking. And it's not just happening in philosophy, it's happening everywhere. And it's not just about understanding the world better, it's about living better. And I think a lot of the things that we talk about a lot are reflective of that too. And just things that people fantasize about. Like, people fantasize about the apocalypse all the time. People fantasize about living on a farm out in the country and like in a communal living arrangement, with their family. And people, I fantasize about that for sure. And I feel like it reflects a chance for us to create more unity, love, dignity that everybody carries in their, like, that's what everybody wants. You know, if you really get down to the bottom of it, ask people what they want. Like, everybody says the same shit. Everybody wants the same shit. You know, they just disagree about the ways to do it, like on a bigger scale. Right? Like we were saying earlier, people will say like, "Oh, communism would work great if in a small group," or capitalism. Sometimes they say that. I don't know why you would want a transactional tit for tat, bookkeep set up in your own family or like tribe or whatever. Yeah, it would work way better. Um, but the thing is, like, you don't even need that. Like, tribal people didn't need that. They didn't need a political theory to tribe. And right, the bigger it gets, the more like moving parts and outside influence and stuff are involved. You have to have those. So we disagree about what's the best way to do that. But I think the fundamental principle that has to be at the forefront going into this new thing is to be humble and accept the fact that we don't fucking know. And we need to talk to each other about it. And we need to figure it out together the best we can. And we need to always be on the lookout for people who are trying to lie and cheat and manipulate so they can get an advantage, so they can take advantage of it. And become that king for a day, or the cult leader or whatever. And at the same time, understanding that those things happen naturally. Like, some people are charismatic, some people, they just natural leaders or whatever. So it's crazy because in Dune he talks about this kind of stuff a lot. He plays with this whole idea. That's what the God Emperor of Dune ends up doing. Paul Atreides becomes omniscient, right? And then he can see all the possibilities for all the different possible futures. But he still struggles with figuring out how to manage everything because, for instance, he sees what they called in the book the unit or galactic jihad, right? His followers like implement his religion, the cult of Paul, all over it because he's like the best. He's basically God. And his son, who was also born with like the same thing he had, he was omniscient before he was even born, while he was still in the womb. Which I think is important because he doesn't have like as much of a sense of identity and self as Paul, because he never developed that. He was always like hearing all the voices of all of his ancestors and seeing all of the possible futures. He was born that way. So in a way, he's a little bit like dehumanized something, but he ends up like realizing the only way to save humanity from themselves is to become the absolute dictator of the galaxy. And he shuts down spice production, and like that shuts down space travel. And it's like 3,000 years. He lives for 3,000 years. he merges with the sandworms and whatever, and he lives for 3,000 years and becomes like the like Caligula of of the empire for 3,000 years. And at the same time, he's engaging in this eugenics breeding program to try to create and manipulate human genes to where they have like a deeply ingrained genetic memory of like this distrust and hatred of charismatic leaders and leadership in general. Like they don't want to be ruled by anyone. And that's like his solution to their repeating of these like cycles of violence and um I don't know. It's a interesting weird theory, but Frank Herbert never finished it, but died before the whole saga. But I think he said something about he was going to end it with like a true democracy, you know, where like now these people have gotten ready for this. And it reminds me of that Henry David Thoreau quote where he says that at the civil disobedience essay that he wrote after he was thrown in jail for not paying taxes, even though he wasn't like making any money, he was just living off the land in Walden. And he knew it was to support the Mexican American War, and he didn't believe in that either. So he wrote a whole essay on it, and libertarian people love it. I love it too, but you know, I'm not necessarily agreeing with some of the like implications they're making out of it. But I do agree with a lot of the ones they at the same time. But really, like, the point is that he says at the very beginning of that thing, he says that government. He says, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm paraphrasing here. I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. That government is best which governs least. And then he says, you know, and I would also agree with the statement that government is best which governs not at all. So they love that shit, right? They're like, oh yeah, Henry David Thoreau. That's maybe why they even had it in that fucking. They had it in this thing, dude. But he says right after that, man, they never talk about this part, and it really bums me out. I think this is the best part of that whole thing. He says, and when we're ready for that, that's the kind of government we'll have. That statement is so important, though. Like, when we're ready for that. Like, right now, we're not ready for that. We're a bunch of fucks, man. Can't figure out how to get along with each other. And that's why I'm always emphasizing that principle. You know, what Martin Buber was saying with the I and thou, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying about in the civil rights movement. I sent that quote to Tree earlier. Fucking love that quote. I don't even think I can read it right now. It, like, brings tears to my eyes. I actually have it here at my desk. I have it hanging up. Read this shit every day, dude. This is only like a small part of it, but I feel like even if you solved all the economic problems, even if you did like what Karl Marx said and made everything like equal fair pay and equal rights and so much. Anyways, if you solved all those problems, there's this French anarchist back in that whole time period when they were just killing each other fucking endlessly before they had Emperor Napoleon, who he blew up a building and killed a bunch of people, and he was in court, and in his like defense he wrote something about two types of crime, right? He said there's two categories of crime. One is called crimes of passion, and the other he called crimes of necessity. He said crimes of necessity are like you're starving and your family's starving and they need food, so you go steal bread. That's a crime of necessity. And he was saying, you know, well, he started out with the crimes of passion. He's basically like, oh, like somebody, they find their wife in bed cheating, like kill the guy or they kill the wife. So that's a crime of passion. He basically skipped over that. He's like, there's nothing we can do about that. But this other category of crime, we can get rid of it, by getting rid of the government. He was an anarchist. And crimes of necessity. He said, we can get rid of crimes of necessity. There's nothing we can do about crimes of passion. But I think there is something we can do, and I think that's like the whole problem is that you can't get rid of this like problem of corrupt leaders and weak people wanting to give up their personal autonomy to a strong leader to make them safe and solve all their problems unless you address that other category. And I think that's really what Martin Luther King was doing in the civil rights. Martin Buber was talking about the I and that, but the Arbinger Institute talks. Landmark Forum talks about the landmark education thing they call racket. Familiar with any of those things? Anyways, this is the quote that I sent to Tree earlier. It's just the last part of it. I have it. This is the core of this whole project and community and all. So he said, this is part of a sermon that he gave. He said, and one day we'll win our freedom, but not only will we win freedom for ourselves, but we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process. Our victory will be a double victory. This seems to me the only answer and the only way to make our nation a new nation and our world a new world. Love is the absolute power. And my favorite part of that is that what he's talking about, not just setting themselves free, but setting the oppressors free. Because they're trapped in this, what the Hegel Lord and bondsman thing. Like, that's really what he's talking about. It's a way to end that. Hegel talks about it too. Like the ultimate culmination of that dialectic process, he says, ends up in, to him, he says God. What he calls God. It's not like the Christian conception of God necessarily, but yeah, I feel like that principle is the way of liberation, and it ties in with like the Zen stuff. That's also why they have that shit here, dude. Also why they have that shit here, because the Zen stuff is talking about the same shit. Like shit, man. I read this fucking thing the other day from see if I can find it. Oh, I have it here. Take a picture. It was from Pima Chodron. If I can find it, I'll try to bring it up. Try to bring it up on the screen. I can search for. Sorry. Really good. Oh, here it is. I found it. She says, this is a cool little book, man. It's she has lots of books, but this one's kind of almost like a devotional or something, but it's, Buddhist. So it's like you can just open a page to any page, or you could go through the whole thing, but it's like a daily, read this little kind of excerpt from something that she wrote. But this one's called The Daring of Having No Enemies. And she says, whether it's ourselves, our lovers, bosses, children, or the local Scrooge, or the political situation, it's more daring and real not to shut anyone out of our hearts and not to make the other into an enemy. If we begin to live like this, we find that we can't actually make things completely right or completely wrong, because things are a lot more slippery and playful than that. Everything is ambiguous, everything's always shifting and changing, and there are as many different takes on any given situation as there are people involved. Trying to find absolute right and absolute wrong is just a trick that we play on ourselves to feel more secure and comfortable. So yeah, I think that that whole idea has to be at the center when we're making these alternative communities and trying to form these like new ways of doing and seeing. I think we have to keep that there, because otherwise we'll create something like that'll just turn into another abomination like this, like what we did now. um Find this other one too. She It was real similar, but it really captures like the whole kind of concept of openness and like holistic thinking, and ties it into the Eastern religion stuff. Because she's coming at it from a Buddhist perspective. So I actually think Grant, if you're still here, I think Grant commented on this on my page because I put a picture of it up on Facebook the other day. I've been taking a picture of like accountability habits kind of album, and I put it up there, and Grant said it was funny because the title of it towards the open state. So edging is OP, man. Fucking. But she says we might assume that as we train, our habitual patterns start to unwind. That day by day, month by month, we'll be more open minded, more flexible, and more of a warrior. But what actually happens with this ongoing practice is that our patterns intensify. In Buddhism, this is what is called heightened neurosis. It's not something we do on purpose, it just happens. Catch the scent of groundlessness, and despite our wishes to stay in a steady, open, and flexible space, we hold on tightly in very habitual ways. This has been the experience of anyone who's ever set out on the path of awakening. All the smiling, enlightened people you see in pictures or in person have to go through the process of encountering themselves and their full blown neurosis, their methods of looking for solid ground. When we start to interrupt our ordinary ways of calling ourselves names or patting ourselves on the back, we're doing something extremely brave. Slowly, we edge towards the open state, but let's face it, we're moving towards a place where there are no handholds, no footholds, and no mindholds. So, like, it's kind of scary, right? That's terrifying. It's like you're in constant free fall all the time. Because that's really how the world is. Like she was saying in the other one, like it's always changing, it's dynamic, it's, complicated. It's always more complicated than we think it is. We want to try to form these like systems and maps and shit to control it. It's like we were saying in even the very beginning, like the human evolution of consciousness project from the beginning has always been an effort to control the destructiveness of Mother Nature. And it can end up to us dehumanizing ourselves and becoming robots, which is like the road that we've been going down. But we have an opportunity to instead like do what she's talking about, where it's more of a embracing the world and reality for what it is and what it's always has been. It's like it also goes into this concept of like people are the most happy. We're the most happy sometimes when we let go of trying to control everything. When we surrender. People have even said this about like like religious experience or meditation or whatever, but also like sexual orgasm, like just times where you kind of just let things be and feel more at ease because you don't necessarily feel at ease. Like, trying to control things is tense, creates tension. I noticed that with my kids over the years that like whenever I try to control variables and like they're doing this and like things are not going how I'm envisioning them and how I want them to go, I start blaming other things and other people for ruining it. And it's like, sometimes it's just like, it's not even worth it, man. It's not worth it. Like yesterday, I was driving up to LA to pick up Alejandra. I wanted to work on the script for the stream tonight. And I wanted to take my laptop, but I had let her use it for school, and she left and locked her door. I called her, and she put me to voicemail. So I sent her a text, need the laptop. I didn't have time. I had to leave, so I left, and I was driving. She messaged me back, and oh, I'm sorry. Maybe like, maybe Mia could like go in my window. I had to open the window and like, no, don't even worry about it. And she messaged back and was like, oh, I'm really sorry. And she put like a bunch of like sad faces. I know that like me as a single dad being stressed out and trying to like control, like, you know, survive, kind of conditioned her to like respond in those kind of ways to me. She's like, she doesn't want to make things worse for me. It's different for her. Thanks, Lou. Thanks for coming, man. I went way over time, dude, especially because you showed up, man, because it's like we went almost an hour over. But I'll see you next time, dude. Let's talk on the phone soon. Catch up. Yeah, I'll finish this story, man. Then we can wrap it up. Um, yeah, I know that like my way of being and trying to be like a control freak in a certain way. I'm not like that extreme. Just generally trying to control all these things and then getting mad at them or like getting frustrated in general around them. It makes things tense, makes things tedious, and I'm sure all of us have had these kind of experiences, like whether we're the one creating the tension or we're the one experiencing the tension somebody else is creating. But it's always like around that, trying to control shit. And in that case, I just realized, like, you know what, man? Like, maybe I don't need it. Like, maybe I can do shit on my phone. Maybe if I get stuck up there and I make it back on time, I can just do the stream from my phone. Like, but as long as I'm in that space of trying to control everything, I'm I'm not able to think in a helpful way, you know, or in like a problem solving way. And that's really what I'm talking about with this core principle of the community, is that that has to be the first principle. You know, we have to look at problems and we have to look at each other and we have to look at things like, how can I help? How can I be helpful? How can I, you know, help things go right in this situation? And instead of you know, looking at everything else and saying like, this is why it's screwed up, you know, think this way, or saying this thing right now. That just creates endless conflict and will put us into the same cycles of conflict, violence, war, struggle, like that we've been doing forever. So instead of God Emperor of Dune like genetically manipulating or turning everybody into robots or whatever, like, to solve these human problems, I think it's really funny because this is like shit that the Buddhists have been talking about since like BC, you know. So like, but I really do think that that's the answer, and building like a culture around that. How do we do that? I think that's something to think about. I think we can like kind of end on that question. Um, yeah, just like, let's remember that it's an ongoing journey, and holding of all this stuff is a destination process that probably goes on. Emphasizing the individual or the collective, whatever. It's not necessarily about parts, and the whole are. let's just keep embracing it with open minds and open hearts and curiosity, creativity, communication, community. We can co-create the next chapter of our. And see you next time.